The early morning mist clings to the rolling valleys, curling like secret whispers around the rugged escarpments of the Lubombo Mountains. You walk slowly through the high grass, its blades wet and shimmering with dew, as if the land itself is exhaling after a long night. Somewhere in the distance a drumbeat echoes faintly, not for war, not for celebration, but for a quiet gathering of elders who speak low under the acacia trees. It is the early 20th century, and though the British Union Jack flutters in government compounds, the soul of Swaziland, what will one day be known as Eswatini, beats stubbornly beneath it. The British arrived not with a great clash of armies, but through treaties, deals, and the steady tightening of administrative webs, claiming they would protect the Swazi people from Boer expansion. Protection, as history tends to show, often comes with a price tag you didn't agree to. The British system of indirect rule slides over this landscape like a thin veil. They appoint resident commissioners, build small outposts and enforce policies, yet they also lean heavily on local chiefs to keep the peace. You see how these chiefs, clad in traditional attire, bow politely to colonial officials in pressed uniforms, only to later turn and speak with their people in words filled with careful defiance. Historians still argue whether this arrangement weakened or strengthened the Swazi monarchy, but it's clear the people never surrendered their identity. Even when the British imposed hut taxes and regulations, the Swazi found ways to blend compliance with quiet subversion, delaying payments, stalling labor demands, and keeping ancestral rituals alive under colonial noses. As you pass through one of the newly established administrative centers, you notice the contrast of British officials sipping tea on a veranda while locals line up to pay dues, their faces calm yet unreadable. The mountains in the background remain unchanged, a reminder that empires come and go but the land endures. Occasionally you overhear stories in hushed voices, how chiefs send messages by runners, how gatherings are framed as cultural but really serve as strategy sessions, and how the British, though omnipresent, are far from omniscient. A quirky detail emerges: colonial officers sometimes complain in reports about too many ceremonies, unable to grasp that those same ceremonies are political acts in disguise. Walking through homesteads, you smell the sweet smoke of cooking fires and hear the low hum of songs that have been sung for centuries. Life carries on in patterns the British cannot fully bend. Even in the schools they build, where English is taught with stiff precision, children still learn Siswati stories at home, their minds holding two worlds at once. You realize this coexistence is not just survival, it's a quiet rebellion. The British, of course, believe they are firmly in control. They draw maps, claim authority, and report back to London about the orderly state of affairs. Yet beneath their feet the Swazi earth is shifting. The people endure not with open revolt, but with a patience that is sharper than any spear. You can almost hear the land whisper, "We are still here." You are only passing through. By the time you leave the valley, the mist has lifted, revealing a horizon dotted with scattered homesteads and the silhouette of distant hills. There is no battlefield, no dramatic clash of armies. There is only the steady heartbeat of a nation quietly waiting for its moment to rise. You step further into the fabric of Swazi life, where the monarchy stands like an old tree with deep roots weathering storm after storm. The British presence lingers like a shadow, yet the kingship remains a living force, commanding loyalty far beyond what colonial administrators can comprehend. You find yourself at the royal kraal, where traditional ceremonies unfold under the watchful eyes of ancestors. The air smells of burning herbs and cattle dung, and the rhythmic pounding of drums thrums against your chest. Here, under the open sky, the Swazi monarchy continues to pulse with authority, undiminished by foreign flags fluttering in the distance. King Sobhuza. I, long before the British came, had already set the tone by consolidating Swazi power and identity, and that legacy does not vanish just because some outsider draws new borders on a map. Now, under British rule, the monarchy adopts a clever posture, outwardly respectful of the new protectors while inwardly nurturing its sovereignty. The British, relying on indirect rule, leave the king a space to operate, not realizing they have preserved the very institution that will one day dismantle their grip. You watch the chief's elders and the king's council navigating these political waters like seasoned fishermen in a river full of hidden currents. There's an almost ironic scene as British officials attend royal ceremonies, standing stiffly in their khaki uniforms while Swazi dancers move in circles, their feet kicking up dust, their shields glinting in the sun. To the officials it is quaint pageantry. To the Swazi it is a declaration, we are still ourselves. Historians still argue whether these public displays of tradition were simply tolerated distractions or subtle forms of resistance that kept the nation's identity alive. One thing is clear, you can feel the pride radiating from the crowd as each ritual reaffirms bonds the British cannot break. A quirky tidbit catches your attention. The British sometimes attempt to modernize royal customs, suggesting changes to attire or protocol, only to be politely ignored. The monarchy absorbs what is useful, discards the rest, and carries on with a quiet confidence. Even the colonial laws meant to standardize governance bend slightly when they hit the hard spine of Swazi tradition. You hear elders murmuring that the king is both a father and a shield, and in these words lies the secret of his enduring influence. Meanwhile, in small settlements, daily life weaves tradition with the odd threads of colonialism. British courts operate, but so do the traditional ones, and locals often choose, the latter trusting their own justice over imported rules. This coexistence creates a strange duality where two systems overlap without fully merging. You see children herding cattle past a British police post, ignoring the uniformed men as if they were irrelevant decorations on the landscape. You notice how even in conversations there is a split polite deference when speaking to colonial officers, but an undercurrent of humor and skepticism shared among Swazi themselves. It's the kind of humor that mocks power without directly challenging it, because patience is the weapon here, not open defiance. A colonial officer once wrote in his diary that he felt like a guest tolerated by the natives. The phrase almost makes you chuckle. The guest doesn't realize he is only temporary. As the sun dips low and paints the sky in amber, you watch the king's advisors gather under a great tree, their voices low but firm. They speak of balancing the old ways with the changes sweeping across Africa. The world beyond their hills is stirring, empires tremble, new nations rise. But here in Swaziland, the monarchy remains the axis around which everything turns. The British may hold the paperwork, the posts, and the taxes, but the heart of the kingdom belongs to the king and his people. Leaving the royal kraal, you glance back and see the silhouette of the king standing on the raised ground, framed by the last light of the day. He is both ancient and modern, both subject and sovereign. You realize that this monarchy has learned to survive not by clashing with the colonial power head-on, but by bending just enough to avoid breaking, waiting for the perfect moment to stand tall again. The morning air smells faintly of coal and iron as you make your way toward Matsapha, where the British have begun to transform the Swazi landscape with their industrial ambitions. The rhythmic clatter of new railway tracks being laid out cuts through the silence of the fields, and the occasional whistle of a steam engine pierces the valley, startling birds into flight. These rails, shiny and arrogant, promise progress on paper, but carry a different meaning for the locals who watch them stretch across ancestral lands. They link Swaziland's resources not to local prosperity, but to British markets draining wealth like veins tapped for profit. You notice how the roads, too, slice through the hills with a clinical straightness, ignoring the curves of the land as if to declare, "We will tame you." Walking closer to the construction sites, you see Swazi men in worn clothes hammering spikes and hauling timber, their bodies strong, but their expressions distant. They work long hours for meager pay, their labor feeding an economy that barely returns the favor. Among the workers, quiet conversations ripple about unfair treatment, dangerous conditions, and the curious question of why so much wealth leaves the land but so little stays behind. These whispers, shared over evening fires and in the shade of railway embankments, become the seeds of something larger, the first murmurs of organized resistance. Historians still argue whether these early labor grievances were the spark for future nationalism or just survival talk, but the effect is undeniable. Awareness is spreading. The industrial boom brings a quirky paradox. While the British believe they are modernizing Swaziland, they accidentally create spaces where workers from different regions meet, share ideas, and form a shared sense of injustice. A man who used to know only his village now talks about conditions in distant mines, about other African workers resisting in neighboring territories, about unions that form like tiny storms. The colonial reports, ever formal, describe minor labor disturbances, but on the ground you can sense the growing discontent simmering beneath polite surface interactions. Passing through a newly built market near the railway, you catch the mixed aromas of spices, sweat, and burning wood. Traders sell both local crafts and imported goods, and you overhear arguments about prices, taxes, and the strange new world where cash replaces cattle as the measure of wealth. Change is not only in the landscape, it is in people's minds. Farmers displaced from fertile land by British settlers adapt to wage labor, reluctantly bringing with them stories of lost fields and ancestral spirits unsettled by the plough of strangers. These stories, often told as laments, harden into quiet anger. In the distance, the British administrative offices stand white and square like small fortresses of paperwork. Inside, officials draft policies with clean pens and cleaner hands, while outside the dirt clings to those who bear the weight of those policies. You can almost hear the irony humming in the air. The very roads and rails meant to strengthen colonial control also carry the seeds of its undoing. Workers travel, exchange ideas, and slowly begin to see that the colonial system is not unshakable. One evening you follow a group of workers back to their makeshift homes where fires crackle and voices rise in soft songs. These are not songs of despair, but of resilience, their rhythms steady and strong. A young man tells a story about a strike in a nearby mine, how workers stood together and won small concessions. The elders nod, their eyes gleaming in the firelight, knowing that small victories can lead to greater ones. You feel the air thick with something unspoken, but powerful hope mixed with resolve. The next day you walk past the tracks again and the sight feels different. The railway still glints under the sun, but now it seems less like a symbol of control and more like a line that connects struggles, weaving the people's quiet resistance across the land. Matsapha, once just an industrial hub, has become a crucible where old traditions meet new grievances, forging a subtle but unbreakable will to reclaim dignity. As you leave, the train roars by carrying cargo toward distant ports, but you can't shake the feeling that while the British believe they are moving goods, they are also unknowingly moving history toward a future they will not control. The air feels warmer now as you drift into the mid-20th century, where the figure of King Sobhuza emerges like a beacon between two worlds. You see him first as a young man wrapped in the vibrant colors of traditional attire, yet equally comfortable wearing a neatly tailored suit when the occasion demands it. Sobhuza, unlike many rulers caught in the storm of colonialism, learns early how to balance the weight of tradition with the tools of modern politics. You follow him as he walks calmly through royal courts, where elders sit in circles under open skies, their voices weaving the old ways into decisions about the future. At the same time, you see him traveling to meetings with British officials where the language shifts to cautious diplomacy and subtle persuasion. It's as if he carries two masks, both real, both necessary. Under his leadership, the monarchy does not fade into ceremonial irrelevance, as it has in so many other colonized lands. Instead, it thrives, quietly expanding its influence while colonial structures crumble at the edges. Sobhuza too keeps the traditional councils active, ensuring his people feel represented even when the British push their bureaucratic models. This dual system confuses colonial administrators who assume the monarchy will eventually give way to the so-called progress of Western governance. Historians still argue whether Sobhuza's strategies were born from instinct or calculated brilliance, but you see the results. The monarchy becomes not a relic, but a cornerstone of resistance. There's a scene that stays with you, Sobhuza, standing beside a British governor during a public event. The governor delivers a speech filled with formalities about partnership and civilizing missions, while Sobhuza's expression remains polite but unreadable. When it's his turn to speak, he doesn't shout or threaten. Instead, He talks about the enduring spirit of the Swazi people, weaving history, land and tradition into words so smooth that even the British applaud, without realizing they've been reminded who truly owns this land. A British officer later writes in a private letter about the king's unusual charisma, unaware that what he calls charisma is actually power. A quirky tidbit emerges during your walk through this chapter of time. Sobhuza, too, has a gift for patience that unnerves the British. They expect resistance to come as protests or uprisings, yet here is a king who waits, who smiles, who plays the long game, while colonial authority slowly weakens under its own contradictions. His presence in international forums adds another layer. When he meets other leaders or engages with global organizations, he presents Swaziland not as a passive protectorate, but as a nation with its own voice. You also notice how Sobhuza bridges gaps between generations. For the elders, he is the guardian of sacred customs, attending ceremonies, leading rituals, and honoring ancestors. For the younger Swazi exposed to colonial schools and ideas, he embodies adaptability, showing that modernity does not have to mean abandoning identity. In this blend, you see the blueprint for the future independence movement, one that does not violently overthrow, but steadily reclaims. Meanwhile, British policies become increasingly clumsy. Attempts to impose more control through legal reforms or economic directives backfire, creating more friction than order. You hear whispers among colonial administrators about the Swazi problem, a phrase that says more about their frustration than about any real issue. The so-called problem is simply that they cannot bend the monarchy to their will. You pass through the royal kraal again during the annual Inkwala ceremony, where dancers stomp, the earth shields gleam, and voices rise like a tide. The British standing at the edges still view it as exotic spectacle, but you know better now. This is not a show. It is a living declaration of sovereignty reaffirmed every season. Under the beating sun, Sobhuza II raises his staff, and the crowd erupts in ululations that echo across the hills. It feels as if the ancestors themselves are answering. As you leave this moment, the thought settles quietly in your mind. The British hold the documents, but Sobhuza holds the soul of the nation. And in the long run, the soul always wins. You move into the heart of Swaziland's countryside, where fertile valleys once sustained entire communities with maize fields grazing cattle and the comforting rhythm of life tied to the soil. Now patches of this land lie under foreign hands, neatly parcelled and fenced, bearing signs that mark ownership in a language not of the people. You walk past one of these fences and hear a farmer muttering under his breath words heavy with loss. The British, like many colonial powers, have not only claimed authority but have also claimed the earth itself, taking the richest lands for settlers and leaving Swazis to toil on less productive plots. This land alienation cuts deep. It's not just property, it's memory, identity, and survival. The colonial system rationalizes this with papers and decrees citing development and proper use of resources, but on the ground you see the effects: families, displaced herders pushed into overgrazed lands, and young men leaving home to work as laborers in mines across borders. It's a slow bleed rather than a sudden wound, yet the pain is constant. Conversations at evening fires tell stories of ancestors buried under fields, now off-limits, of cattle paths blocked by fences of traditions tied to specific hills and rivers, disrupted by lines on a colonial map. The British reports describe these as minor grievances. You feel the quiet fury in those words, how easily power dismisses pain when it is not their own. As you wander through a market, you hear farmers complaining about taxes that must be paid in cash, a foreign concept to those whose wealth was once measured in cattle and harvest. The taxes force them into wage labor, often on the very lands they once called their own. There is a cruel irony in seeing a farmer bending over his old fields now under settler control, working as an employee where his ancestors once stood as masters. Historians still argue whether this displacement was deliberate economic strategy or an unintended consequence of colonial expansion. But for the people living it, the debate is meaningless. The suffering is real. In this atmosphere of loss, resistance doesn't take the form of open rebellion. but of endurance. Farmers cling to traditional practices where they can, planting small gardens behind their huts, holding ceremonies in hidden clearings, teaching children the names of the rivers even when those rivers now run through private property. You see women weaving baskets with patterns that tell old stories, a subtle defiance against the erasure of culture. Even cattle grazing stubbornly on whatever land remains seem to embody the Swazi spirit, quiet, persistent, and unwilling to vanish. A quirky detail catches your attention. Some settlers complain that Swazi workers move too slowly or disappear for ceremonies. They fail to understand that these acts are not laziness, but resistance. When a worker walks off the job to attend a ritual, he is choosing identity over compliance. The colonial economy cannot fully enslave a people who still hold to something greater than wages. Meanwhile, the British try to enforce new agricultural methods, believing they can improve farming by imposing European models. Yet the soil resists in its own way, yielding less under foreign techniques than under the traditional rhythms known for generations. You see a settler scratching his head over failing crops while just beyond the fence, a Swazi woman's small plot thrives, nourished by knowledge passed through countless seasons. The land itself seems to side with its original caretakers. In towns, growing groups of Swazi begin to voice these grievances more openly. Petitions circulate, meetings are held, and activists cautiously write letters to colonial authorities. These actions are small but significant, like drops of water slowly wearing down a rock. The British may not see it yet, but these quiet movements signal a gathering storm. As the sun sets over the hills, you watch farmers returning home with empty baskets but determined expressions. The air smells of dust and smoke, the sky glowing orange and purple. The fences cast long shadows across the fields, but shadows do not last forever. Somewhere in that glow of dusk you feel the land itself whispering to its people, "Hold on, I am still yours." The years after the Second World War bring a different breeze to the valleys of Swaziland, and you can feel it as soon as you step into this moment of history. The colonial officers still walk with their usual posture, polished boots and pressed khakis, but their confidence no longer feels as unshakable. Across Africa, the winds of decolonization are swirling. Countries like India have already slipped from the British grip, and others are rising one by one. You notice how this global shift drifts quietly into the Swazi hills, carried by newspapers, traveling workers, and even the radio broadcasts that hum softly in market corners. The world is changing, and the British Empire can no longer pretend it isn't. Walking through a small town, you see posters announcing new political movements from faraway places. The names of African leaders, Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, Julius Nyerere, circulate like whispered legends among Swazi youth. These young men and women, educated partly in colonial schools yet grounded in their heritage, begin to dream of a future that doesn't involve asking permission to be free. In gatherings under trees, in church halls, and even in beer-brewing homesteads, conversations turn to independence not as an abstract hope, but as a real possibility. Historians still argue whether the external examples of independence were the main catalyst, or simply accelerated what was already inevitable. Meanwhile, the British try to tighten their administration as if clinging to a rope that is slowly slipping through their fingers. They introduce minor reforms hoping to appease growing demands. But these reforms feel hollow to the Swazi people, who see them for what they are, a stalling tactic. Sobhuza, too, ever the patient strategist, watches closely. He understands that global politics can be as important as local movements, and he positions Swaziland within this larger current of decolonization with remarkable precision. You see him attending meetings, sending envoys, and building relationships not only with African leaders, but also with international organizations that hold sway over Britain's image abroad. The quirky part is how colonial reports begin to sound more anxious. Officials write about unusual levels of organization among Swazi groups and note with mild alarm the growing unity between traditional structures and educated elites. They expected these two forces to clash. Instead, they are slowly merging under a shared goal. Even in towns where British influence is strongest, Swazi traditions flourish alongside modern ideas. It's a blend the colonial mind struggles to comprehend how can a people hold on to ancient ceremonies while also demanding modern rights. As you walk along the railway line built decades earlier, you meet workers who once labored silently but now speak openly about independence. They talk of unions, of fair wages, of reclaiming what was lost. Their voices no longer hide behind cautious whispers. In the markets, women selling produce exchange news about independence movements, weaving political talk seamlessly into daily chatter about prices and weather. You realize that hope is not loud or chaotic here. It is woven into life itself, quiet but unbreakable. The British continue to host ceremonial events, trying to showcase their supposed benevolence. You watch one such event unfold. Flags flutter, officials give speeches about partnership and progress, and Swazi dancers perform in full regalia. The colonial officers clap politely, thinking the ceremony honors them, but you see the truth in the dancers' eyes. The performance celebrates the Swazi spirit, not the empire. Every drumbeat feels like a heartbeat saying, "We are still here." By the late 1950s, political movements gain more structure. The Swaziland Progressive Party, though short-lived stirs, debate about the future. Even churches, often seen as apolitical, begin to speak subtly against injustice. International observers take notice, and the British find themselves under pressure not just from within, but from a world that now views colonialism as an outdated stain. You hear the word independence, spoken more openly now, no longer hidden in whispers. It rolls off tongues with a new confidence, as if the people have already claimed it in their hearts. As you climb a hill overlooking the royal kraal, the evening sky glows pink and orange, the air warm and still. Below, fires flicker as people gather, voices blending into a low, steady hum of expectation. The winds of decolonization may have begun far away, but they have reached this place, curling around every tree, every hut, every drumbeat. You realize the British can build fences, offices and laws, but they cannot hold back the wind. Somewhere in that gathering dusk you hear a voice, maybe real, maybe imagined, whispering the same words you've heard before. Hold on. Change is coming. The sky hangs low and grey as you step into a chapter where the stakes shift from fields and markets to polished negotiation tables. In this era, London finally begins to notice that Swaziland is not just a quiet backwater, but a kingdom steadily steering toward its own destiny. The British invite Swazi representatives to talks, believing they can control the pace and the terms, but they underestimate the patience and skill of King Sobhuza II. You picture him walking into those rooms with a calm that unsettles even the most seasoned colonial officials. His demeanor says everything. There will be no hasty concessions, no rash demands, only a steady push toward what has always belonged to his people. The negotiation rooms are a study in contrasts. On one side, British diplomats in tailored suits, flipping through thick files of legal jargon. On the other, Swazi delegates draped in both formal attire and the weight of tradition, carrying the voices of their ancestors. The conversations stretch for hours, sometimes days, with pauses so long you can hear the ticking of the clock. Yet in those silences lies strategy. Sobhuza too knows that every moment the British hesitate, they reveal just how much they want to retain influence. Historians still argue whether these talks were balanced or tilted, but as you watch, it's clear the British no longer hold all the cards. A quirky image stays with you during one negotiation break. British officials sip tea in fine china cups, while the Swazi delegation, instead of matching the formality, shares a quiet laugh among themselves, eating simple snacks from home. That laughter isn't disrespect, it's confidence. They know their strength lies not in ceremony, but in unity. The British might have the power of an empire, but the Swazi have the power of belonging to their land and their people. Over the years, these talks evolve. They move from guarded pleasantries to substantive debates over land rights, political representation, and the pace of constitutional reform. The British offer gradual steps, hoping to prolong their influence, but Sobhuza counters with proposals that maintain the monarchy's authority and protect Swazi traditions. You see how cleverly he blends modern statecraft with the timeless expectations of his people. Unlike many leaders who reject tradition in the name of progress, Sobhuza makes it clear that tradition is not an obstacle, it is the foundation upon which independence will stand. Outside the negotiation rooms, Swaziland is alive with anticipation. You walk through villages where radios buzz with fragments of news, and even elders who have never left their homesteads know that something monumental is being shaped far away. At the markets, traders discuss the talks as if they were family gossip, their voices full of curiosity and pride. In towns, the youth grow restless but hopeful, watching closely to see whether these meetings will finally translate into real change. By the early 1960s, the British begin to accept what has been obvious to the Swazi all along. Independence is not a question of if, but when. International pressure mounts as the United Nations scrutinizes remaining colonies, and African nations, one after another, take their seats in the community of free states. Swaziland is no longer isolated. It is part of a continental wave the British cannot stop. In one particularly tense meeting, you hear a British official remark that granting full independence to such a small kingdom might be premature. Sobhuza too responds not with anger, but with a smile and a quiet remark about how long the Swazi have survived without anyone's permission. The room falls silent for a moment, and in that silence, history tips slightly in his favor. You leave those negotiation halls with the sense that something irreversible has been set in motion. The British may still sign the papers and set the dates, but the true transfer of power has already happened in spirit. It happened the moment the Swazi delegation walked into those rooms, knowing they were negotiating not as subjects, but as equals. As dusk falls on this chapter, you watch the British flag fluttering outside the colonial offices, its edges fraying slightly in the wind. The air feels heavy like the pause before rain. Somewhere inside, pens scratch on documents, but outside the hills stand unchanged the rivers flow as they always have, and the people wait certain that soon their kingdom will stand under its own sky. You step into the mid-1960s where the air feels charged with expectation, yet softened by the cautious calm of careful planning. The negotiations with Britain have borne fruit, and now the focus turns to shaping the political blueprint for a sovereign Swaziland. In 1964, a new constitution emerges, its pages crisp but its roots tangled in competing visions. On one hand, the British insist on frameworks that reflect their parliamentary ideals, eager to ensure that even as they let go, their influence lingers in the institutions they leave behind. On the other hand, King Sobhuza II and his advisors work diligently to ensure that Swazi customs and the monarchy's central role remain intact, blending the imported structures with the deep rhythms of tradition. You stand in the assembly where this constitution is debated, and you can almost hear the weight of history in the room. British officials speak of democracy and checks and balances, while Swazi voices stress the need to keep the king's authority strong to make sure the country's soul is not lost in borrowed laws. Historians still argue whether this constitution truly balanced both worlds or leaned too heavily toward British interests. Yet as you listen, you notice that Sobhuza II's calm presence reassures his people that whatever the papers say, the monarchy will endure. In the towns, the arrival of this constitution stirs mixed emotions. Some celebrate it as a step toward independence, while others worry it gives too much power to parties aligned with colonial interests. You overhear conversations in cafes and markets, young men debating politics, older women, warning not to forget the land issues still unresolved, and everyone wondering what independence will really look like. A quirky scene unfolds at a rural meeting. Villagers gathered under a tree passing around a single copy of the Constitution, as if it were a rare artifact, flipping pages they cannot all read, but can certainly discuss with passion. Political parties rise and clash during this time, adding new voices to the kingdom's evolving identity. The Swaziland Progressive Party, led by Dr. Ambrose Zwane, gains attention but also friction as its advocacy for rapid democratization sparks controversy with the monarchy. The king observes carefully, understanding that hasty party politics could fracture the nation. His response is subtle but firm, reinforcing traditional structures while allowing enough political space to satisfy international expectations. It's a delicate dance between preserving heritage and meeting the standards of a world watching closely. Meanwhile, life outside politics continues with the quiet strength of the people. Farmers still plant their fields, cattle still roam the hills, and ceremonies still fill the air with song and drum beats. Yet even in these familiar rhythms, you sense a shift. Conversations about independence are no longer whispers, but open declarations. The idea of a self-governing Swaziland feels less like a dream and more like an approaching dawn. British officials, though still influential, begin to step back, their presence less commanding than before. Some express surprise at how effectively the monarchy navigates these changes, while others grumble in private about losing another jewel from the imperial crown. You pass one such officer smoking a pipe on a veranda, staring into the distance as if contemplating the end of an era. Perhaps he knows that the empire's days of deciding other nations' futures are almost over. By the time the constitution is fully implemented, the framework for independence is in place. Elections are held, political debates grow louder, and international eyes turn to this small kingdom tucked between South Africa and Mozambique. Unlike many other territories caught in violent struggles, Swaziland's road remains remarkably calm, shaped by negotiation rather than war. You realize that this calm is not weakness, it is strength, the kind born of patience and unity. As you stand on a hill overlooking the capital of Mbabang, the sun sets in deep gold and crimson hues. The town lights flicker on, small but bright, against the darkening sky. You can almost hear the heartbeat of a nation preparing for its moment. The 1964 constitution may not be perfect, but it has cracked open the door to sovereignty. The British flag still waves for now, but you can see in the eyes of the people below that they already walk as if the land is entirely theirs. The wind picks up, rustling the trees, carrying with it a promise you've heard before. Soon, soon, the kingdom will rise on its own terms. The sun rises on a cool September morning in 1968, its light washing over the hills and valleys of Swaziland in soft gold. The air hums with an energy you can almost taste. This is no ordinary day. You follow a crowd moving steadily toward the capital, men and women dressed in their finest traditional attire, colourful cloths fluttering in the breeze, beads glinting like drops of dew. Children run ahead with laughter, while elders walk slowly, their faces serene yet proud. Today the kingdom steps fully into its own skin. Today the colonial shadow recedes for good. In Mbabane the scene unfolds with quiet majesty. British flags, once symbols of power, are lowered with the formality of an ending chapter. Beside them, the new flag of Swaziland rises, its vibrant colours catching the morning light, its lion emblem roaring softly against the sky. You watch as the crowd erupts into ululations and cheers, the sound weaving through the air like a song that has waited decades to be sung. There is no bitterness here, only the triumphant calm of a people reclaiming what was always theirs. Historians still debate whether the British granted independence out of goodwill, pressure, or inevitability, but to those gathered today the reasons do not matter, the outcome is what counts. At the center of it all stands King Sobhuza, draped in traditional regalia, holding the staff of his ancestors with an ease that comes from knowing he was born for this moment. His presence bridges the ancient with the modern, the spiritual with the political. When he speaks, his voice rolls across the crowd like a river, steady, assured, and deeply rooted. He does not shout or boast, he simply declares the nation a free-weaving history, gratitude and hope into words that settle into the hearts of everyone listening. Nearby, British officials stand stiffly, their expressions polite but subdued, as if they understand they are witnessing not just a ceremony, but the closing of a long, complex story. One adjusts his tie nervously, another smiles faintly, perhaps relieved that this transition is peaceful. The quirky image of a British officer handing over documents to a Swazi official feels almost symbolic, paper exchanged for sovereignty, the empire retreating with quiet formality. Across the kingdom, celebrations ripple outward. In villages, fires burn brightly, Meat roasts over open flames, and the sound of singing fills the night. Women dance in vibrant circles, men beat drums that echo across the hills, and the stars above seem to shine a little brighter. Children too young to grasp the full weight of the day wave small flags and chase each other through the fields. The mood is not just festive, it is sacred, as if the ancestors themselves have joined the dance. You notice how tradition is everywhere in this celebration. Unlike many new nations that embrace independence with imported symbols, Swaziland roots its ceremony firmly in its own culture. The Inkwala spirit, the connection to the land, the honor to the ancestors, all these elements weave into the fabric of the day. Even the modern speeches and international guests cannot overshadow the beating heart of the kingdom, which pulses strongest in the songs sung in Siswati and the stomping of feet in the dust. As night falls, fires continue to glow across the hillsides. You sit near one, listening to an elder tell a story to the gathered children about how the land endured foreign rule but never lost its soul. His voice is soft, his words slow, and the children listen with wide eyes. The stars above twinkle like they're nodding in agreement. Around the fire, you feel the weight of this day settle into memory, becoming part of the long story of the Swazi people, a story that is far from over. The capital quiets as midnight approaches, but even in the stillness you sense the change. Independence has not only altered the flag or the laws, it has reaffirmed something deeper, something unbroken. You glance at the new flag one last time, fluttering gently in the night breeze, and it seems to whisper back at you, "We are free and we are ourselves." The dawn after independence breaks softly over the hills, the mist curling around the valleys like a gentle reminder that some things remain constant even when history shifts. You walk through villages where the echoes of celebration still linger, ashes from last night's fires glowing faintly, song fragments carried on the breeze, and children still clutching tiny flags with sleepy pride. The British have gone, the flag has changed, and yet life resumes its rhythm. Farmers lead cattle to pasture, women pound maize with steady hands, and elders gather beneath trees to discuss the new day. Swaziland, newly sovereign, begins to shape its own path in a world that often expects post-colonial nations to stumble. Unlike many other African countries where independence ushered in immediate political turmoil, Swaziland's monarchy continues to stand firm at the center of national life. King Sobhuza II, now recognized not only as a traditional leader, but as head of state, walks calmly through these early years of sovereignty, reinforcing the message that independence does not mean abandoning the old ways. You see him attending ceremonies with the same devotion as before his presence, a thread linking past to present. Historians still argue whether his consolidation of power, eventually abolishing the multi-party system in 1973, was a stabilizing force or an authoritarian move cloaked in tradition. Whatever the interpretation, it is clear that the kingdom chooses a path distinctly its own, neither fully Western nor entirely isolated. You notice how the monarchy weaves tradition into modern governance, a blend that confuses outsiders but feels natural to the Swazi people. The king is not just a political figure, he remains the cultural heart, the spiritual center, the custodian of the land. Even as new policies emerge, even as the country navigates relationships with South Africa, Mozambique, and the broader world, the monarchy's authority remains untouched. In a time when many nations experiment with imported political models, Eswatini, as it will later be renamed, clings proudly to its identity, choosing to walk to its own rhythm. There is a quirky charm to how this small kingdom manages to balance the global and the local. International visitors arrive expecting a Western-style government and instead encounter a monarchy that holds open councils under the sky. Foreign journalists sometimes describe it as old-fashioned, but to the Swazi it is simply the way things are meant to be. You overhear one diplomat sipping tea in Mbaban remark that the country feels like stepping into another time, unaware that he is actually standing in a place that has mastered the art of continuity and change. Economically, the new nation faces challenges, limited resources, reliance on agriculture, and the pressures of being landlocked between two powerful neighbors. Yet there is resilience in the way people adapt. Workers still travel to South African mines markets, buzz with trade, and new industries begin to take root slowly. International aid and partnerships trickle in, but the Swazi sense of self-sufficiency keeps the kingdom from becoming just another pawn on the global chessboard. You hear young men debating the future of education, women organizing local cooperatives, and elders urging everyone not to forget the importance of land and tradition. As the years pass, the kingdom's story becomes one of subtle defiance. While many post-colonial states struggle to define themselves, Eswatini continues to assert that its monarchy is not a relic, it is the living spine of the nation. The decision to rename the country from Swaziland to Eswatini decades later reinforces this, reclaiming a name that echoes in the Siswati language and the voices of the ancestors. International observers may raise eyebrows, but for the Swazi, it is a simple truth. Identity is not negotiable. You walk once more through the royal kraal, where ceremonies still stir the air with drumbeats, dust, and song. The king lifts his staff, and the crowd responds with ululations that ripple into the night. Above, the stars scatter like sparks across the dark sky, and you realize that this kingdom, though small in size, carries a story as vast as those stars, one of patience, endurance, and quiet strength. As the night deepens, you sit near a fire, listening to the low hum of voices telling stories of the past and hopes for the future. The flames flicker, casting long shadows on the ground, and the warmth seeps into your bones. You think back to the misty valleys under British rule, to the negotiations, the dances, the struggles over land, the laughter at the negotiation tables, and the quiet rising of the Swazi flag. It all flows together into a single seamless story, a nation that never truly let go of itself, even when history tried to write another script. The fire crackles softly, and the voices fade into a gentle hush. The Kingdom of Eswatini breathes quietly under the stars, sovereign and proud, a place where tradition and modernity walk hand in hand. You close your eyes, and in that stillness, the land whispers once more, "We endured, we are free, and we are ourselves." The night settles over the hills like a soft blanket, the stars above scattered in quiet constellations, and you feel the pace of everything slowing, softening, becoming almost dreamlike. The voices you've followed through this journey, farmers speaking by their fires, workers murmuring under railway embankments, elders chanting during ceremonies, and King Sobhuza's calm declarations now fade into a gentle echo that lingers at the edge of your thoughts. You imagine the mist creeping once more into the valleys, curling around the trees and homesteads, carrying with it the memories of all that has passed, the shadows of colonial rule, the resilience woven into each generation, the moment when a flag rose and an empire fell silent. There's no need for loud triumph here, no need for grand fireworks or dramatic endings. Instead, the victory lies in the stillness of a people who remained themselves, who outweighted an empire with patience sharper than any weapon. You picture the kingdom as it is now, its mountains standing guard, its rivers flowing steadily, its people living each day with the quiet dignity of those who know who they are. The monarchy, so often misunderstood by outsiders, continues to stand as both a symbol and a guide, reminding everyone that history can bend without breaking, and that sovereignty is sometimes won not by force, but by the unwavering strength of identity. As the fire burns lower and the night deepens, the world feels hushed, as if even the stars are listening. You take a slow breath, letting the calm settle into you, and you know the story has reached its end. The land sleeps, the people rest, and the kingdom breathes freely under its own sky.
All right, let's ease into the quiet now and let the story drift away like mist over the hills.